All right. Hello, everyone from AP World. Today we're going to talk about medieval Europe. In other words, we're going to be focusing on Western Europe after the fall of Rome. In general, Western Europe in the medieval era was very decentralized politically. We do see some exceptions to that. And one of the most important and one of the first centralized kingdoms, but it didn't last very long, would be the Frankish kingdom, or we also eventually refer to it as the Carolingian Dynasty. So, just as a recap, if we want to go back to the fall of Rome from period two, Rome, for if we really want to pinpoint it with an exact date, we tend to say it was 476 CE because that's when the last Roman emperor was removed. And he's later replaced by a German. And after that, you no longer have political centralization under Rome. So, as a consequence to that, you're going to see first off that there are continuing invasions and trade interruptions in the area that used to be the Roman Empire. So, the urban population subsequently starts to decline. And after that, you're going to see that the formerly Roman political institutions are going to be replaced by Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, Franks. So essentially, the people that were first conquered by the Romans and then later won their land back from the Romans actually end up replacing the Romans in power. But what this means is that Europe, for all intents and purposes, is now politically divided. So you see that these are some of the kingdoms that end up resulting from what used to be Rome. And a lot of these leaders end up converting to Christianity and also adopting Roman law along with it. And there was a pragmatic reason for this. Many of these leaders decided to convert to Christianity so that they could then assimilate into the already Christian population. Because these areas used to be part of Rome, Christianity had spread there. So essentially, many of these rulers thought that by becoming Christian, they would have a better chance of being a legitimate ruler. So again, as I was saying before, the Frankish kingdom was one of the first, best, and earliest examples of centralization in medieval Europe. Again, this tends to be the exception, not the rule. So the Franks, by the 6th century, had conquered most of Roman Gaul. So you might remember that Gaul was essentially modern day France. Caesar conquered it. But what's interesting about the Frankish people is that although their name is Frank and they are in essentially modern day France, they were not French culturally. They were actually Germanic. But they have a prominent military and political presence in Western Europe. After they converted to Christianity, they gained increasing popularity. And by the 8th century, the Franks consolidate their power. They found the Carolingian Dynasty, which only makes the Franks more powerful. So the first of the Frankish kings was Charles Martel, or he was also called Carolus Martel, and that's where they named the Carolingian dynasty. Martel ended up rising to power after he defeated a Muslim army that had already defeated Spain. So basically, he ends up driving out some of the remaining Muslims from the Umayyad dynasty, drives them further into the Caliphate of Cordoba. And if you know more about Christian history moving forward, eventually the Muslim population will be completely expelled from Europe and back into northern Africa. So this is still a period when there is a Muslim presence in Western Europe. All right, so what else? The most important and most powerful Carolingian leader was Charlemagne, which translates into Charles the Great. So he rules from 768 to 814 CE, and he is known mainly because he temporarily reestablishes centralized rule in present day in what is now present day France. He is also largely responsible for the expansion of the Carolingian dynasty, so he adds new territory to the map. He also maintains decent diplomatic relationships with outside kingdoms. So he has diplomats present in the Byzantine Empire to the east, as well as the Abbasid Empire in the Middle East. One interesting example of that is that the Caliph of the Abbasids at the time actually received a gift from Charlemagne. He sent him an albino elephant as a gift and sort of as a diplomatic gesture. So just interesting, totally random. But anyway, the Carolingian Empire really reached its peak under Charlemagne's rule. So he expanded it to reach as far as Spain, Bavaria, and Italy. He also was engaged in war for most of his rule. He is involved in a 32-year campaign against the Saxons, which were from, not surprisingly, Saxony in modern-day Germany. And many rulers in Eastern Europe and Southern Italy paid tribute to him, which gives you a sense that he truly was the most powerful emperor, at least in Western as well as Southern Europe, if outside kingdoms are actually paying for military protection and trade privileges. How did Charlemagne rule? As I said earlier, he actually spent most of his reign traveling, mainly during military campaigns, but he did establish a capital city, which was Aachen in modern-day Germany. So again, what we can establish from that is that the Carolingian dynasty was so large at its peak that it was both in modern-day France and in modern-day Germany, as well as parts of Italy and Spain. But despite the fact that this is an example of some political centralization, in the medieval era, there still wasn't a very good bureaucracy, which is one of the reasons why this kingdom did not last much longer than Charlemagne's rule. Charlemagne did appoint counts, and they were normally from an aristocratic background. So basically the job of the count was to serve over a more local jurisdiction, and they held political, military, and legal authority in these certain areas. But these counts were not really, partly because they were from a noble background, not the most accountable. Essentially, they didn't do the best job working for the government. Charlemagne, interestingly, despite the fact that he gained so much territory, that he was such a prominent ruler, he did not want to be called an emperor, not at first. Part of this was because the Byzantines actually believed that they were the only military leaders, so they didn't want another person to take on that kind of title. But by 800 CE, the Pope, who was Leo III at that time, decides to crown Charlemagne as emperor. And he does this on Christmas Day, 800 CE. So actually, this is seen as a major threat to the Byzantines because now the emperor, there's sort of a Western threat to what was previously seen as just a Byzantine role. So what's interesting is we know, if we go back to the Great Schism, or rather, I'm sorry, Great Schism hasn't happened yet. If we go back to the fall of Rome, when Diocletian split up the eastern and western realm of Christendom, the eastern part, if you remember, was the stronger part, right? It was the western part that sort of crumbles into decay. So by crowning a Western man the title of emperor, this shows us, at the very least, this is a sign that Western Europe is recovering. But again, it's a temporary gain. So Charlemagne dies, as ancient rulers tend to do, and that's the beginning of the end of the Carolingian dynasty. The main reason why this is because his heir was Louis the Pious, and he was not the strong military leader that his father was. He lost control of many local authorities, which gives us a sense of how weak the bureaucracy truly was. And after Louis dies, he splits the empire up into 3 different parts. So that's always a sign of the decline of the centralized kingdom, if ultimately the territory is divided. So the Carolingian Empire officially is not completely over yet once it splits in thirds, but the empire is already on the beginning of its decline, and that is facilitated further by Viking invasions. The Vikings were at their peak. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about the Vikings in a minute, so I'm not going to say too much, but the Vikings really were at their peak between the 8th and 11th centuries in Western Europe. So they engage in a series of raids. Several of them are in the Carolingian dynasty, so they weaken it. And also, of course, the empire was already moving towards decentralization at this point, so they really lacked the kind of government they needed to ward off these Viking invasions. Also, once the central government starts to crumble, local leaders claim authority over the monarchy. So that's a true sign of decentralization right there. Additionally, other kingdoms like England and Germany were more successful in defending against the Vikings when compared to the Carolingians. And the Vikings actually, even though they were not big conquerors, they didn't like to, expand their kingdom. There were a few exceptions to this, and one of them was that the Vikings established an independent kingdom in France. And you can see that this map shows us some of the different places where Scandinavian people or people of Nordic descent end up establishing other kingdoms, and some of them were in what at that point was the Carolingian Dynasty. So that starts to break it down too. And most European governments had become increasingly decentralized because of, first off, these invasions, and also internal conflicts. So what the Carolingian Dynasty shows us is that there were exceptions. In general, the rule of thumb for politics in Western Europe was that they were decentralized, but the Carolingian Dynasty marks a very important exception to that rule. And let's wrap up this this segment rather by just comparing these Eastern and Western political institutions, right? So we've already discussed the Tang and Song dynasty in China. Let's look at how politically a European institution could compare to that. So first off, again, this is kind of the exception of the rule, right? Because we already said the Carolingians are sort of an anomaly. Europe doesn't normally politically centralize in the medieval period, but nonetheless, here are some similarities. First off, both kingdoms use their own justification, a religious justification for leadership. The European monarchs call it divine right, and the Chinese call it the mandate of heaven. And so ultimately they say that there's a reason for them stepping into the throne, that they were chosen by some sort of deity. So both those Eastern and Western kingdoms have that in common. And in both East and West, the monarchs had a very tenuous relationship with the monarchs. During periods of centralization, it's the nobles that have the most power. So it's not surprising to us that when areas centralize politically, that they have to sort of compete for power with the nobles. So you see that happening in both the Carolingian dynasty and in China at the same time. But one of the key differences between China and the Carolingians is that the outcome is very different, right? So, for example, when the Carolingian Empire split, there's an intensification of feudalism and local power. But in China, there was a period of great prosperity, which is interesting. So basically, you see that there's continued centralization in China even after the Tang dynasty falls. Whereas in Europe, once the Carolingian dynasty falls, you see several centuries of political decentralization after that. So, some examples of China's prosperity, in case we forget. The Grand Canal, which was started in the Sui dynasty and further developed in both the Tang and Song dynasty, helped facilitate political power by maintaining constant contact with different regions, and it also facilitated tribute payments. The Silk Road also became safer during this time, and a lot of this was due to fortified command posts and garrisons of soldiers. And also the civil service exam prevailed. It was very challenging, and it also required an expanded education system to support it. But such an institution, there was no such thing as a civil service exam in Europe. So because of that, there isn't as much of a demand for these very organized education systems. And also we see some ideological differences between East and West. Hopefully, obviously, but nonetheless, the Roman Catholic Church provided the major ideology for Western Europe during this period. And leaders, typically monarchs, but also nobles, saw the legitimacy of their rule through their relationship with the papacy. So no matter what country you were in, you always wanted to have a good relationship with the Pope, right? And of course, if you sent one of your cardinals to be Pope eventually, then that really made your country gain prestige. Chinese rulers, on the other hand, claimed authority through the mandate of heaven, But Confucianism and Buddhism were also very highly influential in their political structures. So basically, you see one main ideology, Roman Catholicism, in Europe, sort of running the show. But in China, there's a mixture of ideologies that's influencing its political structure. There's just the general mandate of heaven, but also Confucianism and Buddhism. A good example of that would be Empress Wu Zetian of the later Tang Dynasty tried to make Buddhism a state religion, but later, after she dies, there's persecution of Buddhists, and ultimately Confucianism triumphs as the main ideology in China up until the 20th century, but I would argue that Confucianism has made a huge revival after the Cultural Revolution. But nonetheless, at the very least, Confucianism is really the predominant ideology from the end of Wu Zetian's rule until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. All right, so let's take a break. We'll pick back up with the Vikings in the next video, so stay tuned and thanks.